Hi, this is Matthew again. Today I want to talk about the proposed treaty regarding pandemics that has recently passed the Senate and is now going to the House. Hindsight makes clear that the World Health Organization's or WHO's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was inept. China shirked its responsibilities under the WHO's International Health Regulations or IHR by being neither transparent nor cooperative in alerting the international community to the outbreak, refusing to share genomic sequences of the disease, and impeding the visit of international health experts to assess the situation. Instead of challenging Beijing's lack of cooperation, the WHO parroted the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP's talking points and even praised the regime's response to the pandemic. As a result, the COVID-19 pandemic was far more deadly and economically harmful to the US and the rest of the world than it would otherwise have been. To avoid such a repetition, the US and other WHO member states convened an intergovernmental negotiating body to draft a new agreement on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. The the draft is highly problematic and does little to address the shortfalls revealed by COVID-19, instead focuses on empowering the WHO, trampling intellectual property rights, and mandating funding by the US and other developed nations to support health systems in developing countries, likely including China. Unless the draft undergoes substantial improvement, the US should oppose this treaty. However, the Senate recently passed the draft, and it now goes to the House for passage. This is a real problem as it hands off controls to the WHO and away from our government. It has been misreported that the WHO draft would give the WHO authority over US domestic pandemic policies. As the draft makes clear, states have, under the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of international law, the sovereign right to determine and manage their approach to public health, notably pandemic prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery of health systems, under their policies and legislation, provided that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to their peoples and other countries. Nonetheless, the draft treaty is deeply flawed and is currently drafted, should be rejected by the Biden administration and the House. Some of my major concerns include, it represents an expansion of WHO authority. The WHO performed terribly in the initial stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite obstruction and opacity by Beijing, WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus echoed Chinese misrepresentations of the nature of the threat from COVID-19. The WHO downplayed Beijing's unwillingness to allow a WHO technical team to visit Wuhan and its refusal to share critical genomic data and virus samples. On the contrary, yielding to political pressure, the Director General praised China repeatedly. Subsequently, the WHO has been unable or unwilling to confront China and insist on a thorough, independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Nonetheless, the WHO draft would dramatically expand WHO's authority to declare a pandemic and, thereby, trigger provisions in the treaty that would reallocate resources and encourage governments to waive intellectual property rights. It also proposes giving real-time access to WHO to 20% of the production of safe, efficacious, and effective pandemic-related products, including diagnostics, vaccines, personal protective equipment, and therapeutics, to enable equitable distribution, particularly to developing countries, according to public health risk and need and national plans that identify priority populations. Half of the 20% is to be provided as a donation and the other half at affordable prices. At least until the WHO is reformed, expanding the organization's power in this manner should be a non-starter. It also doesn't address some weaknesses. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the weaknesses of the IHRs. Their voluntary nature allowed China, without repercussion, to conceal the outbreak, refuse to share critical information, and impede access by WHO expert teams. Although the draft WHO treaty makes transparency and cooperation mandatory, using the term shall when referencing facilitating access and sharing of research and genomic data, there are no repercussions for non-compliance. Thus, there is little reason to believe that China would comply with these obligations any differently than it did under the voluntary IHRs. Worse, emulating the WHO's quiet abandonment of its COVID-19 investigation, the draft does not insist on completing an independent investigation of the origins of COVID-19, sending the wrong signal to China about its past intransigence. The bulk of WHO focuses not on addressing the weaknesses in pandemic prevention and detection revealed in the COVID-19 pandemic, but on establishing a system to direct expenditures by the treaty parties, require regulatory and policy changes relating to pandemic-related products and intellectual property, and equitably redistribute knowledge, technology, and other resources. The treaty provides disincentives for private research and development related to pandemics. Despite acknowledging that intellectual property plays a critical role in developing medicines, treatments, vaccines, and life-saving technology, The draft WHOCA specifically calls on the parties to support waiving patent rights and sharing proprietary technology and knowledge on pandemic-related products. Of further concern is that this would establish a precedent for waiving intellectual property rights on other medicines, treatments, or technology. For instance, UNAIDS Executive Director Winnie Byanyima recently stated, "The World Trade Organization rules allow life-saving medications to be traded in the same way we could trade luxury goods. They allow pharmaceutical companies to set the price wherever they want, hoard their technologies, and reap billions at the cost of lives." To me, that's racism, even though people don't want to call it out, valuing the profit of a few people, who happen to be white, over the lives of black and brown people around the world. See Caroline Kimu, "Big Pharma must value African lives above profits," warns head of UNAIDS. Denying companies the opportunity to profit from investments by abrogating property rights will curtail future investment and force some companies out of business. Chilling investment in health research is exactly the opposite incentive needed to deal with future pandemics. It may cost billions for the U.S. for sustainable and predictable financing. Under the draft, the parties shall raise financial resources to implement the WHOCA and, additionally, commit to prioritize and increase or maintain domestic funding by allocating in its annual budgets not lower than 5% of its current health expenditure to pandemic prevention, preparedness, response, and health systems recovery. It is unclear if the 5% figure refers to total healthcare spending, all government health expenditures, or just federal health expenditures. On the high end, for the U.S., this would be equivalent to $213 billion or 5% of the $4.3 trillion in total U.S. healthcare spending in 2021. In addition, there are more unspecified financial commitments. The draft states that the parties shall commit to allocating, by their respective capacities, 20% of its gross domestic product for international cooperation and assistance on pandemic prevention, preparedness, response, and health systems recovery, particularly for developing countries, including through international organizations and existing and new mechanisms. Parties must also establish a global compensation mechanism for injuries resulting from pandemic vaccines. The amount of these additional financial commitments is to be determined. The cost of these commitments to the U.S. taxpayer will likely involve billions, likely hundreds of billions, of dollars. The independent panel, commissioned by the WHO, recommended financing an international pandemic financing facility with contributions of approximately $5 to $10 billion per annum to finance ongoing preparedness functions with the ability to disperse up to $50 to $100 billion at short notice by front-loading future commitments in the event of a pandemic declaration. It also includes benefits for China as a developing country. Not only does the draft WHOCA let China off the hook for its role in exacerbating, possibly creating, the COVID-19 pandemic, but it also rewards Beijing. As with many UN resolutions and agreements, the draft endorses the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities among nations. In essence, this means that developed countries, like the US, Japan, and in Europe, with more resources or capabilities should bear a greater share of the costs than so-called developing countries. Despite China having the second largest economy in the world, the UN considers this means that China will likely be a beneficiary of WHOCA obligations for parties to, among other provisions, incentivize the transfer of technology and know-how to developing countries, support waiving intellectual property rights to grant the use of the intellectual property and other protected substances, products, technology, know-how, information and knowledge to developing countries, encourage patent holders to waive or manage payment of royalties by developing country manufacturers, and ensure equitable distribution of pandemic-related products, including diagnostics, vaccines, personal protective equipment and therapeutics. Beijing already engages in the theft of intellectual property on health technology. This agreement will provide legal cover, especially if it can be linked to pandemic preparedness. The draft represents an assault on free speech. The treaty calls on the parties to tackle false, misleading, misinformation or disinformation. This ignores the fact that governments and the WHO have themselves been sources of disinformation, notoriously. For instance, the WHO tweeted that preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of COVID-19. Indeed, deviation from WHO and government policy during the pandemic was often met with strong rebuke. However, evidence is mounting that those policies were unsound. Guidance from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on the efficacy of masks shifted over time, and a recent analysis questions the effectiveness of mask mandates in preventing the spread of COVID-19. There is an increasing understanding that the economic, social, and educational costs of school closures far outweigh the benefits. A recent study found that natural immunity acquired by a COVID-19 infection was associated with lower incidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection, regardless of the variant, than mRNA primary series vaccination. The theory that COVID-19 originated in a Chinese virology lab was once dismissed as a conspiracy theory, has gained increasing currency. The WHO and government experts have been proven wrong too often to give them authority to police disinformation, especially when it infringes on the internationally accepted right to freedom of expression. No reservations are permitted in the draft. The U.S. Senate regularly conditions approval of a treaty on certain provisions, called reservations. The draft WHOCA prohibits such reservations. While the Senate should not use a reservation to vitiate the purpose of a treaty, it must still retain the ability to modify the terms of a treaty so that it comports with U.S. law and the Constitution. By banning such reservations at the outset, the WHOCA disqualifies itself from serious consideration by the Senate. There is also an emphasis on equity. The draft states that the WHOCA is guided by equity, which it defines as the absence of unfair, avoidable or remediable differences among and within countries, including between groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, demographically, geographically, or by other dimensions of inequality. Unsurprisingly, the terms equity and equitable appear more than 30 times. Americans deserve to know precisely what kind of commitments their government is making to the rest of the world through treaties. A treaty guided by concepts such as equity, a gauzy term rooted in Marxist ideology, should not serve as the guiding principle of any international commitment. There are also blank spots in the draft and inter-pandemic obligations. In addition, there are still many blank spots in the WHOCA draft. One area still to be filled is the definition of many terms used in the draft. For instance, the draft commits the parties to the progressive realization of universal health coverage. The term universal health coverage remains undefined. Elsewhere, the WHO states, universal health coverage means that all people have access to the full range of quality health services they need, when and where they need them, without financial hardship. It covers the full continuum of essential health services, from health promotion to prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, and palliative care, but in the U.S. political context often is understood to mean government-provided health care. Considering the contentious U.S. debate over the proper role of government in health care and the willingness of some U.S. courts to rely on international agreements to interpret U.S. legal obligations, conservatives should be leery of any references to universal health coverage in the treaty. Finally, the scope of the treaty is enormous, committing parties to providing funding, enacting policies, and adopting legislation and other measures not just during a pandemic but during inter-pandemic times. Thus, even though treaty parties technically retain their sovereign control over domestic pandemic response, complying with the treaty will require significant policy changes and implementation whether a pandemic is declared or not. In conclusion, I believe that the WHOCA Zero draft is significantly flawed. The draft states that the WHOCA shall be subject to ratification, acceptance, approval or accession by states, so the WHOCA is a treaty requiring Senate advice and consent under the process outlined in Circular 175. Specifically, it would involve commitments affecting the nation, affect state laws, require implementing legislation by Congress, and be permanent. As written, the WHOCA should not receive the Senate's blessing. The Biden administration must realize that due to its scope and nature, any treaty resembling the current WHOCA draft will require the advice and consent of the Senate. Nonetheless, the Obama administration at times circumvented Senate consideration and declared international agreements, such as the Paris Climate Agreement, legally binding. Congress should take proactive steps to ensure that any pandemic treaty is submitted to the Senate, including conditioning WHO funding on this process. During the upcoming fourth meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body to consider the draft WHOCA treaty, it is incumbent upon the Biden administration to demand substantial changes to narrow the agreement and excise or modify its objectionable provisions. Only a treaty that would preserve American sovereignty, address the mistakes of the COVID-19 pandemic, and protect the intellectual property of U.S. companies should be considered for approval by the United States. I hope this addresses some of the concerns that many of you have voiced about this WHO draft. It seems like our government is trying to pass this without letting the public comment on it. It has already passed the Senate and is now in the House. I am asking all of you to call your representatives to voice your concerns. This treaty is just another step toward a one-world government where the people have no voice in its government. The last time I checked, I did not have a voice in who was my representative on the WHO board, so I don't like the idea that we would give up all our rights during a pandemic to this third-party entity. Especially since China isn't under the same obligation. To watch other videos like this on issues that impact Americans, go to our website at nehemiahreset.org or to our channel on rumble.com. We produce new videos each week to highlight issues that impact our culture. Sign up for our weekly newsletter so you get a weekly email highlighting our latest videos. Also, share them on social media or email to your friends. These are important issues that all of us need to be aware of. We are a 501c3 organization, so donations are tax deductible. You can give us a donation on our website. We use donations to help pay to produce these important videos. Thank you for your help.
Thank you for watching this video from Nehemiah Reset. We hope you found it informative and helpful. Our mission is to assist Christians in developing a biblical worldview as it pertains to relevant cultural issues. We seek to inform Christ's followers, equip them, and mobilize them into action to vote for their biblical values and to actively engage the culture. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to our Rumble, YouTube and Facebook channels. You can also visit our website at nehemiahreset.org to learn more about our vision, our resources, and our upcoming events. Thank you for your support and God bless you.